Welcome to the Panteva Perspective, Corporate Immigration and Global Mobility.
Welcome to the Panteva Perspective, Corporate Immigration and Global Mobility with immigration attorney Iskra Panteva. Iskra is the founder of Panteva Law Group in Chicago, where she helps companies, entrepreneurs, and highly skilled professionals navigate the complexities of U.S. business immigration. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about how employers can plan for the transition from H-1B sponsorship to the permanent residency and what that process looks like over the long term. Ms. Iskra, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, of course. How is everything?
It's good. It's good to see you, Miss Iskra. So, this is a very complicated stuff, and I love your perspective on it. So, once a company hires someone on that H-1B visa, how early should they start thinking about that long-term sponsorship?
Ideally, they should start thinking about it from day one, even before they hire an employee like that. Obviously, when you have a sponsorship situation, a need for an employee to be sponsored for an H-1B, you definitely want to think and consider whether or not a 6-year period is good enough for the employer, or they can eventually look into sponsoring them for a long-term permanent green card. And this is something that they will need to consider either in their policies or before they hire an employee. Usually, a green card process takes about 3 to 5 years, and that will require filing of certification with the Department of Labor, the so-called PERM. There is an I-140 application. And if the employee or applicant is from China or India, there is a huge backlog that needs to be taken into account. So waiting 2 or 3 years to consider that might be a little bit too long, and there might be a situation where the window of filing for this can kind of, narrow down. And then the employee can be either forced to be out of the country for a while, or there is a lot of complications that the employer will need to be considering at that point. So, of course, if they can start the process as early as possible and consider that either in their policies, immigration policies, or while they are interviewing that candidate, that will be ideal.
What usually makes an employer decide that a worker should move beyond temporary visa status?
Well, a lot of times it's retention, right? You have an employee that you are investing 1, 2, 3 years to train. You have spent a lot of time and effort, a lot of financial resources to get that employee trained. And at some point, they might be so good that they are very difficult to substitute. And that's one of the reasons that they can decide, okay, it's time for us to think of a permanent solution. Sometimes, replacing specialized talent is really costly, especially when we are looking at IT personnel, people in computer science, people that are engineers. It is very difficult to find that type of talent. And then sometimes the employee also has, during those 6 years or 5 years or 3 years or whatever time they have been here in the United States, they might have started a family. They have children that have started school. They might have bought a home. So during those period of time, they have to think about some permanent solution to their plans in life, right? So a lot of times the employee themselves will bring that up while they have a conversation with the employer. But it's definitely, and sometimes there is a wake-up call, right? You have an employer that has sponsored them one time, they're sponsoring them second time. They are receiving requests for evidence, or they're having some pushback from the administration, and they're trying to protect their workforce to the greatest extent possible. So those are also considerations. And a lot of times they say, hey, do you know what? We don't want to deal with 100,000 fee right now. We don't want to deal with any of those changes in policies. How can we protect our workers better? And that's when the conversation sometimes come up for a green card petition.
What about that long-term commitment? What kind of long-term commitment is a company taking on once it begins that green card sponsorship?
Well, the commitment is serious. You as an employer have to attest that there is a bona fide job. There is a job that is that is open, and you are trying to fill it with the U.S. workers, and you have to prove that there is no able and willing U.S. workers to take that position. The employer also need to conduct a job testing, right? They're testing the job market, and they have to conduct recruitment, basically to see whether or not there actually is U.S. workers that are willing and able to take the job. And if there is, obviously that PERM process will fail. And if there is none, then the employer is able to file for a green card for that employee. Filing and funding the I-140 is another consideration. Obviously, that is um, the employer needs to provide attestations to the government that they're able and willing to pay the salary, that they are able and willing to provide, financial resources in order for them to kind of support that process. And that can be a costly process for the government, for the legal fees, as well as for a lot of travel expenses if the employee needs to travel.
So, Mrs. Gray, can you share an example of a situation where timing became especially important in planning an employee's path to that permanent residency?
Yeah, I mean, the classical scenario is you have an H-1B employee who is at some point working for the employer. They have been working for them for 3-4 years, and they decide, hey, we need to look for a permanent solution. How we can provide a permanent solution to that for my immigration status. And that happen a lot of times. What happens is when you have 3 years and you are renewing your H-1B visa, that can become a problematic, right? Especially if you are in a situation where you have to file PERM certificate, I-140, and the government takes for a very long period of time to process those applications. A lot of times that happens when the employee hits 5 years of H-1B, then the process will take much longer than 1 year, right? So those are very difficult timing considerations, and they depend on the H-1B of the employee, but it also depends on um, what are the government processing times. I have clients that we have, process their visas and green cards for like a year and a half, kind of 5-6 years ago, right? 7 years ago, maybe. And we have clients right now that, take 2 to 3 years to 4 years. So definitely depends on the government and how the government is processing those applications, how fast they are, whether or not there is a new immigration policy that has been implemented that usually will slow down the process. So all of those things are big considerations. And if the employer is missing the window to file for the employee, there is a lot of difficult decisions that needs to be made. Maybe the employee will stay in Canada, or they will go to another country. They will go home and work remotely. And those are always problematic situations because a lot of times you have to uproot the whole family, and you have to make arrangements for relocation. And that's always pretty costly for the employer and the employee at the same time.
So, how much of this process depends on an employer, their participation, versus actions taken by the employee?
Yeah, green card application tends to be very employer heavy. They are very much involved in this process. We are working constantly with recruiters. We are working with the HR personnel. We are working with the general counsel. And the reason why they're so much involved in this process is because they are ultimately the one that are going to be doing all the attestations with the Department of Labor, making the application with the Department of Labor, doing the recruitment and testing of the job market, doing the interviews, and making sure that there is no able and willing U.S. worker to take the position. So all of those things are on the part of the employer, right? The employee, in a lot of ways, doesn't have much to contribute to this kind of process. They will need to provide, evidence about their background, right? Maybe some information about their previous employers, about their education. But in general, mostly, almost everything, all the burden is carried by the employer.
So, Ms. Iskra, how do visa backlogs and priority dates affect planning timelines for employers sponsoring of foreign workers?
Well, we are in a situation right now where there is a lot of backlog, especially for people from different countries, like China, India, in the employment-based preference categories. So once your employer or the beneficiary, once they are going through the process, the employer will need to file a PERM certification. And with that certification, they're basically placing the beneficiary in the line to wait for their green card. This is considered, it's called priority date, and means that they are on the line and this is their date. Now, for certain countries like India, for example, right now we are still seeing backlog. They're looking at, I think, 2012, 2013. So we are looking at about 13 years of backlog before these people can even file unemployment-based application for a green card. So it takes a very long period of time, and you have, you definitely have a long waiting time for this. So the strategy here needs to be to consider different things, right? Early I-140 filing, AC-21 extensions, which is basically an extension of the H-1B status beyond the 6 years because of the PERM filing. And there is other alternatives, right? EB-1A filing. But definitely it's a very frustrating process, especially from people born in India or China, because of this long backlog. We have a lot of times, we have clients, for example, that have been in the universities here. They have gone through OPT, they have gone through H-1B, and 20 years later, they're still waiting for their green card to arrive. They have gone through the process, through all of the legal channels, and they are still waiting for decades in order for them to get their green card.
So what happens if an employee is approaching that H-1B 6-year limit before the green card process is far enough along?
So obviously there are not a lot of options here. The options are getting narrowed down because of the timeline. A lot of times what they can consider is NIW, EB-1A. Those are usually self-sponsored petitions, but sometimes an employer can file that. The other option is to outsource the employees or near source them to Canada or Mexico, where, obviously that's a little bit easier because it's the same timeline, the same, there is no time difference. It's a little bit easier to work remotely, but those are the options. The PERM process right now takes about 2 to 3 years. Then you have an I-140 that will take about 6 to 12 months on a regular processing. And then you have an I-485, which takes about 6 months if the numbers are there, right? If there is available numbers for those visas. So pretty complicated process, pretty complicated timeline. There is not a lot of, unfortunately, there is no a lot of decisions that can come out that are that can satisfy everybody in this situation. That's why we always urge people, start thinking about this process as early as possible. And we have clients that are, they are calling us even before they even start working on H-1B, because they want to know what's going to happen if they are going through that process and they're on that path.
So, how can that delayed sponsorship planning create problems later in the employee's immigration timeline?
Well, as I said, when you have a backlog and you have a later priority date, there will take long period of time. So if you have used 5 or 6 years of your H-1B and all of a sudden you're starting to wait for your green card, that will add up. Let's say you're from India, you're waiting 13 years for a green card plus 6 years on H-1B. So we're looking at 19 years, right? So these are kind of the timelines that we are looking into. When there is a rushed PERM, there is always a lot of problems. There might be some mistakes on the PERM application, and that's always a big no-no for the Department of Labor. Any kind of typo can derail the whole process, and we need to start the whole process again. Obviously, it will be the worst thing for somebody to encounter that kind of situations where you've been waiting for 2 to 3 years for your green card application, and for some reason, because of a typo, you need to start all over again, right? And sometimes you're not going to have you're not going to have available time to do that. So start. That's why we always say early start doesn't have it's a low cost for you. Late start, it can be catastrophic sometimes, right?
So, to kind of wrap things up, Ms. Iskra, at what point does the conversation shift from temporary work authorization to permanent sponsorship planning?
Usually, it depends. We see different things for different employers. So, if an employer have a population of employees that need H-1B sponsorship or any kind of non-immigrant visa sponsorship, obviously, most of the time they will have some kind of policy in place where they say, we are going to hire somebody, and then in 6 months, if we are happy with their performance, then we're going to start the green card process for them. There are some other employers that will start at the beginning. The moment they start H-1B, they will start with the green card process. And then there's some obviously smaller employers that don't have that kind of policy. But usually the conversation should start, at the time where the employer is sure that they want to maintain that employee long term, right? And that's when they should initiate the process if they don't have a policy.
Good stuff, Ms. Iskra. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode of the Panteva Perspective, Corporate Immigration and Global Mobility. To learn more about Iskra Panteva and the work she does with the employment-based immigration, visit panteva.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and share this episode with someone who may benefit from this information, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.